Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. DCL serves a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Marli Mesibov. Marli is a content strategist with a passion for the user experience. Her work spans websites, web applications, and mobile for enterprise companies and startups across the country. She is an editor at UX Booth and a frequent conference speaker. Marli can also be found on Twitter with her handle at Mars in the Stars, where she shares thoughts on user experience design, content strategy, and the Muppets. You can learn more about her and her work at http://marli.us. Without further ado, welcome Marli.
Hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here today with you guys, our online here today, where we all get to meet from really all over the country, all over the world, because really it doesn't matter for those of you who, like me, are in Boston, or if it's still morning for you out in LA or San Francisco, or even if we've got a couple of people in the UK or Europe anywhere for whom it's already evening. We are all doing this very similar work, whether we're content strategists or UX professionals of one sort or another, and yet nobody knows what that is. At least nobody outside our own little club, our own little circle. I was thinking about this recently. I was taking a cab home from the airport here in Boston, and I was thinking about how lucky my cab driver was. Here he is, when he goes home, when he goes to visit his mother over the summer, and she throws a barbecue, and he's seeing all of her friends who he hasn't seen in years, and they say, "How are you, Joe? What are you doing these days?" And he says, "Oh, I'm a cab driver." They say, "Oh, so you must know the streets really well," or "You must just get such amazing views of the city. Which highway do you take when you're trying to avoid more of the tolls?" They know immediately. They have a mental model for what that means. Now, on the other hand, when I go home and visit my mother over the summer and she throws a barbecue and I see her friends who I haven't seen in ages, and they say to me, "Marli, what are you doing these days?" And I say, "Oh, I'm a content strategist." And they look at me and they go, "Huh." And then my mother sweeps in from somewhere and says, "Oh, she writes on the internet." And so people get this idea. They know content strategy has something to do with writing, but they don't really know what it is. And it's not just content strategy. This happens to IAs. It happens to UX designers, UI designers, all kinds of different, all of these different roles. Nobody knows what they mean. And so in honor of that, I've come up with a game that I like to call Whose Job Is It Anyway? And so I'm going to throw on my best Drew Carey impersonation. None of you can see it, and that's okay because I don't do a very good Drew Carey impression. But we're going to play this game anyhow. Whose job is it anyway? And Adam's going to help us out. So here are our categories. I have gone on LinkedIn, and I have found various job descriptions for UI designers, information architects, usability experts, content strategists, visual designers, and front-end developers. And these are all jobs that actual recruiters and actual enterprises and startups, various companies are looking to hire. And I've taken bits and pieces of these different job descriptions, and I will read selections to you. And you need to, your part in this game is to type into the chat section what job you think we're describing, which of these 6 jobs. So here's our first one. This person validates content delivery by developing and completing usability test plans, evaluating user flows and traffic patterns, studying user feedback, and coordinating with usability specialists. Is this a UI designer, an IA, a usability expert, a content strategist, a visual designer, or a front-end developer? Adam, are we getting some responses?
Yes, we are. And we got a couple saying usability expert.
Mm-hmm.
And one saying all.
Okay. So we're getting some usability experts, some people saying all. Actually, this job is hiring for an information architect. Wouldn't have guessed that. Here's our second one. We'll see if we can do a little better. This person is responsible for designing, developing, modifying, and implementing computer-generated and photographic artwork, images, and layouts for the web. Think about that one for a minute. Again, here are our 6 choices. What job, whose job is it anyway? Adam, what are we getting?
I got a handful right now for visual designers and one for a UI designer.
I'll be honest, visual designer is what would have been my guess as well, and yet, ding, 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 front-end developer. All right, here's one more. This person is going to gather and synthesize business, brand, market, and user requirements and collaborate on user workflows, information architecture, and wireframes. Whose job is it anyway? Adam, what are we hearing?
I'm hearing information architects, UA designer, and content strategist.
Honestly, I think
I
it's
also
a
got
little bit...
usability. I also just got a usability
All right.
expert.
So we're actually getting a little bit of everything here,
And then
except
another
for
IA.
visual designer. Let's go back and take another look at that one, because that one particularly to me, you know, I think from one stand we can look at it and we can say, all right, collaborating on all of these pieces, sure, a visual designer is going to do that, and yet that's really interesting that somebody is looking for a visual designer who specifically works with brand, market, and user requirements and is collaborating on the workflows. That's really interesting to me. All right, last one. This candidate will develop content and data, information, attributes, and classification schemes. Whose job is this one? Adam, what are we hearing?
I'm hearing information architect, UI designer, content strategist.
It looks like, guys, we are 1 for 4 today because it is a content strategist. So clearly there's a problem with the words that we're using. And I'm going to tell you guys a secret. I know that I titled this webinar that it gives you the sense that we're actually going to get some clarity around these. Unfortunately, that's a lie. We can't fix this today. We can't, a handful of us in rooms across the country, across the world, wherever we may be, we can't solve the problem of thousands upon thousands of people using different words to describe the same things and using the same words to describe different roles. What we can do, though, is we can look at the way that these jobs and their titles are evolving. We can understand where the confusion is coming from and how these jobs, where these jobs started from. And that's what I want to talk about today. We're going to look at this evolution. We're going to understand how we evolved to this point in our careers and what our jobs were initially intended to accomplish. See, this is a really exciting time to be working in user experience. Some of you out there are probably literally writing the books and creating the best practices. We can make changes every day. If one of you leaves this webinar today and thinks, something Marli said didn't strike me quite right, you can go write a blog post about why you think that the opposite is true. You can change the Wikipedia article. You can shoot me an email. We might talk about it, and I might say, you know, I think you're right. Other people might join on to your cause. We can actually change the face and the shape of the roles that we inhabit today. That's not something you can do as a cab driver. You can't say, well, I'm going to completely change, cab driver is now going to mean somebody who drives a limo. You can't do that. It means it's existed for so long, and it is so set in what it means and how that job works and what it entails. It's tough to change it. So that's what I want to talk about today. And part of the reason that this is so important right now is because with change happening so quickly, it's starting to scare people. And so they're trying to get more and more specialized. And when you get specialized, you start ignoring everything except for your specialization. You start sort of digging this hole or building this tower of knowledge. And as you build your tower of knowledge, you sort of shut everything else out. And that tower, that's a silo. When we talk about silos existing, silos being created, silos stopping us from working with one another, nobody sits down one day and says, I think I'm going to go work in a silo. What they say is, you know, I really love the way that content informs the user experience. I'm going to focus on on content strategy. And they start to learn more, and they start to become a specialist, and they start to become the team expert on content strategy. They become a content strategist. And one day they realize they actually never learned Photoshop skills in there, or they never learned, they haven't done front-end development in so long. Now that they're a content strategist, they're siloed into that, and they no longer are up to date on everything happening in all those other areas of UX. Now, there's nothing wrong with becoming a specialist. In fact, we need to become specialists in something. Many of us do anyhow. Not everyone can be a jack of all trades. And most jack of all trades have a little bit of information about everything, but don't have any specialization. So somebody needs to specialize here. But the key is that we can't allow these silos to isolate us. We need to be building bridges between them. You can't work in silos. Because when you do, you end up creating content, and some of you have heard this story before of how I actually interviewed with a company that literally had their content strategists working on one floor of an office, and their project managers in a different floor, and their developers in a totally different building across town. And the only way they were communicating was after they'd finished their part of the process was logging it into a system that would then alert the next team member that it was time for them to do their work. And that sort of conveyor belt UX with everybody split up, it doesn't work. It ends up with everything very fragmented. The content looks messy and disjointed. It doesn't fit right into the design. The design either ends up being too clunky or too heavy, or something happens wrong so that it doesn't load quickly enough because the designers weren't taking into account the things that the developers knew. We have this very fragmented UX, and we don't want that. So if we want to be able to specialize in our jobs, and we want to be able to understand how we can work in the bigger picture and how we can work with others, then we need to get a sense for our history. History is a really interesting thing to me. See, I feel for a long time now I've been going to webinars and to conferences and to hear people speak who talk to us about the future. They tell us about the Internet of Things, about how we are designing the future, we are building the future, we are the future, we are the next generation, our children are the next generation, our children are the future. We're always looking at the future. That's what our culture does. We build movies about the future, we write books about the future that warn us away from certain futures or urge us to consider our future. But the past informs the future. And it's only by looking at some of these jobs back when they were first starting out, when people were starting to really to make them very easily distinctive, make them different from anything else that existed. That's how we can figure out how in the future we'll be able to work together and how we'll be able to build the future. So Don Norman coined the term UX design. And within that huge area of UX design, we generally consider there to be visual design, UI design, information architecture, content strategy, usability, front-end development. UX design is really the entire process. I often describe it as being the creation, the designing in the same way that, for example, city design is designing a city, but it's not actually artistic per se. Urban planning is design. It's more design in terms of creation, and UX design is the same way. It doesn't have to be just the visual. UX design is really looking at creating an experience for an end user. And so that includes the content strategy, the information architecture, all of these different areas, all of these different jobs actually that we looked at the beginning when we were playing our game. So the bigger three that we have here in this particular infographic or this particular diagram, the visual design, the content strategy, and the front-end development. To me, those are our primary colors because those three are fairly easily distinguishable from one another. It's when we get into IA and UI and usability, those are a little harder for people to define. So we'll start with the big three, we'll look at their history, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of those inner three. Start with visual design. Some people actually use the term visual design these days as a pejorative. I hear that frequently. I'm not just a visual designer, I work in UX. They want to differentiate it from UX design. But visual design is really something that informs both the user interface and the information architecture. And we can see this every time that a client says, oh, I like the design, but could you make that bigger? You know, I like the wireframes rather, but could you make this part bigger? And we say, actually, that's going to become more prominent through the visual design. That's us saying the visual design is going to be a big part of the user experience. It's going to be part of what tells the user click here or pay attention there. It directs their eyes. It directs their attention. It tells them what's important on the page. Visual design encompasses graphic design, imagery or use of color, shapes, typography, form. It actually enhances usability. In some senses, I would say that visual designers are the closest to the original definition of design. It's certainly what most laymen think of when they hear the term design. That's why I feel it's so important to separate out that UX design is design in the way that city design, urban planning, urban design. It's a different sort of design. It's a different definition. In a way, they're almost just two homophones, except they're also spelled the same. Now, there are visual designers who do their own interaction design and their own research and their own usability. But the key skill set that most employers look for are those Photoshop or Illustrator skills. Because it's that ability to work with the form that separates it out from content or development work. Usability.gov earlier this year defined visual design and explained a successful visual design does not take away from the content on the page or function. Instead, it enhances it by engaging users and helping to build trust and interest in the brand. I love that. I think that's such a great explanation of what a visual designer truly does. Next up, content strategy. Content strategy is very new. The earliest references that I could find through the Googles are from about 1997. Now, in 1998, Razorfish began a content strategy department, and they wrote a few articles describing it and explaining it. But the term really started gaining momentum in 2008 when Alyssa Park put together a content strategy issue. And that included the article in which Christina Halvorson first defined content strategy. And here is that definition. It says, content strategy plans for the creation, publication, and governance of useful, usable content. Now that was 1998. But content strategy still picked up some traction, but then it sort of stagnated. Now I think a big part of that was that in the early 2000s, the economy wasn't doing great. And so a lot of companies weren't interested in spending large budgets on these new weird terms for these brand new positions they'd never heard of before. What they were interested in hiring was a copywriter because that's what they'd always heard of. So a lot of content strategists got work as copywriters and just included some strategy in their work. And it's almost as though it's almost as though they were in hiding. Even today, a lot of content strategists I know started work as researchers or journalists or even creative directors. And the only common thread leading through them was that they had a sense of empathy and they looked at the big picture. They didn't just write copy. They didn't just look for what they were doing with their words. They looked at what importance those words had, how they were connecting with the person at the other end of the screen. They looked at, were they being consistent? Were they creating a brand? Were they working with the visual designer? Now, UI designers are often designers who started off in maybe graphic design and then learned the UX best practices. But content strategists seem to often be people who worked in creative or empathetic positions, even social workers, who then learn to apply that thinking to content. So what happened after the early 2000s when we had that poor economy? Well, you may have heard this phrase, content is king. Not many people know that Bill Gates actually wrote that. He wrote that in an article. That was the title of an article in 1996. And actually, around that same time, in 1995, Anne Rockley started the Rockley Group, which is now known for doing content strategy. And at the time, they were already doing content strategy, but nobody called it that. So now we jump forward past 1998, all the way to the year 2010. All of a sudden, all these copywriters start saying, I'm not a copywriter, I'm a content strategist. Why was that? Well, part of it is the timing was right. The economy was starting to pick up. Google's Panda update came out in February of 2011. That made a huge change because the Panda update was the first of Google's updates that started identifying content that really got at a purpose as opposed to just keywords. Also, the iPhone had just come out. So all of a sudden people need their content in two different places. And they needed a strategy to do that. So content strategy, we're talking about words, video, anything that connects to the end user. Visual design, we're talking about branding and form and where you're drawing the eye to. So how about front-end development? This is the third major area of our Venn diagram of UX roles. And front-end development is interesting because some of the work that front-end developers do is clearly development work, and some of it is almost UI work. One of my favorite definitions of front-end development comes from Josh Long. He says, when we discuss the front end of the web, what we're really talking about is the part of the web that you can see. It's the part that the users interact with. It's our drop-down menus, our disabled buttons, our sliders, our contact forms. As far as the user experience is concerned, this is the development side of things. Right? The back end, that impacts the user sometimes, just in terms of obviously we need the site to actually be there or the application to actually work. But when it comes to things that you can test, things that you can try out different ways of doing it, and what the constraints are going to be for that design that we're creating, that's front-end dev. So front-end dev ends up helping with the design because they're the ones who tell the designers what interactions they can actually use. Pretty easily distinguishable from visual design and content strategy. Not as easily distinguishable from those smaller pieces that stuck in between, the interaction design or usability. I love this. I know this is a little out of date, but I love these memes when they went around what other people think I do, and then it always ends with what I actually do. But this one is actually quite accurate. You've got the content strategists who really just think of the front-end development in terms of the metadata, the pieces that impact the content. The project managers who mostly are just frustrated at how actually having to consider front-end development slows things down. And I say that with all the love in my heart, having started off my career as a project manager. There's what the clients think you do, which is some combination between the matrix and just a string of binary. What designers think I do, again, they're thinking in terms of what they need from front-end development, basically Dreamweaver. What I think I do, most front-end developers, they recognize how content needs them for one thing and design needs them for something else. And so they think of themselves as they're the linchpin. Maybe in some ways they're right. And then what they actually do, which is kind of a combination of all of it. So these next three fields that we're going to look at, they're sort of the in-between jobs, but they're still focused on the user experience. That's what connects them all. And what differentiates them is their deliverables. We're going to start with information architecture because this has a very clear history. The term IA was coined back in 1976 by Richard Saul Wurman. He co-founded the first TED Talk, so if you know Richard Saul Wurman, that's probably why, and he chaired the TED conference until 2002. And in a talk about him, Gary Wolf stated that the reason that TED Talks are organized in the way that they are is because they're also a way of organizing information. And he says the presentation of information can be more important than the information itself. Now, Richard Saul Wurman, he was an artist, an architect, an urban planner, and a graphic designer. And he started looking at the structure of data and design. This is back in the 70s, before we had websites. But he said, why aren't we viewing this data, these designs, in the same way we view buildings? Why aren't we structuring the information that we have to show, or the information that we're dealing with here, in such a way that it builds well? So IA has these roots in architecture and structure. But its goal is to connect meaning to form, to identify the relationships between the content and the design types. And what really separates it out is the types of deliverables it's had. Now, Dan Klin said back in 2013 that IA is the stuff that is never rendered in pixels and it's never rendered in code. But it still has deliverables. It has sitemaps and navigation. They're sort of the blueprints for a website, if we want to continue in our architecture metaphor. Next, we'll look at UI design. Some people would consider this the most difficult area of UX to explain. UI design describes the interface that we can see with the buttons, the menus, the layout. But of course, those are also created by visual designers. And the interactions behind them, as we said, are often based off constraints given by front-end development. So I want to look at interfaces and consider where they sit specifically within UX design. A common definition of UX design is that UX design improves the usability, ease of use, and pleasure provided in the interaction between the user and the product. But in the interaction, isn't that interaction design, which is also a synonym for, or used often as a synonym for user interface design? Well, maybe this will clear things up. Interfaces have always existed. On the very first computer, on the very first screen where anybody had to interact with a computer, there was an interface. It wasn't a very attractive interface, but it was an interface. So the history of UI design can be summarized just by the fact that interfaces have existed for as long as computer programs have existed. Good UI design is UI design that considers what the user needs. Good UI design is UI design that considers the user's experience. And then we get into usability. Now, I don't know if you remember, it's been a while now, back when we were playing that game at the start, not one of the job descriptions were for a usability specialist. And the reason is, I actually could not find a usability specialist job description. Now, in this Venn diagram, usability is sort of a key part of all of this. But nobody seems to have the job to focus on making it usable. Some people might say the user researcher focuses on that. The Nielsen site, Jacob Nielsen, breaks down usability into a very specific definition, though. He says It comes down to learnability, or how easy it is for users to accomplish basic tasks. Efficiency, once they've learned the design, how quickly can they perform those tasks. Memorability, which says that if the user hasn't been to the site in a while, how easily can they pick it back up again. Errors, how many errors do they tend to make, how severe are the errors, how easily can they recover from them. And satisfaction, really just how pleasant is it to use the design. So whose job is usability? I think it's part of the entire user experience. In fact, if you have ideas for a position that fits better into this area between front-end development and content strategy, I'm always looking for ways to improve this Venn diagram and possibly just put a giant circle around the whole thing called usability, because we all ensure that products are learnable, efficient, memorable, satisfying, and unlikely to cause errors. So there's our history lesson for the day. Now let's bring it into the future. I've already covered the fact that I'm not sending you home or back to the rest of your day with no more confusion. I just can't do that. But I can give you some tips and some tools to help you stay away from silos. Because when it comes down to it, I really like my job. I love working as a content strategist. But too often, when I'm lucky enough to not have to do the work all by myself, I then find that we're either duplicating work, or somebody's getting protective or defensive, or I'm getting protective and defensive about whose job it is to do what, and there's just this unnecessary confusion. So silos are clearly not the answer, because then our work, like I said, it comes out fragmented. It doesn't look good. So how can we work? We can use activities, exercises, soft skills, and tools. Let's go through really briefly some of the big reasons that we don't want to work in silos. First of all, the business is going to waste time and money when two people are both doing the same work. Secondly, if you and I, let's say that you are an information architect and I'm a content strategist, and we both start working on putting together a sitemap. Since we're not the same person and we don't share a brain, it's unlikely that we have done the exact same thing. So now it's going to take additional time to figure out which one we should be using, and one of us is going to have our work essentially just thrown out. Or we'll have to redo it. Also, Leah Bewley wrote this great book a while ago called The User Experience Team of One. But we should be relishing the fact that we don't have to be user experience teams of one all the time. And one of the benefits there is that we can share others' expertise. When you work in a silo, you're not getting that benefit of other people's expertise. We need to build those bridges to all the other silos. We need to get our tin can telephones. And we need to hear from all of those other experts. And then lastly, and this is the big one for me, when you're working on a team and you say, okay, I'm going to put together the user journey and I'll come back next week with it complete. When you first get started, you might have a brilliant idea. It might be absolutely the best idea that anyone could ever have and the best version of this user journey that could ever be created, except it has a minor flaw. And as much as we don't like to hear about potential flaws, if somebody else was aware of what you were doing, they might be able to point it out. You can make a minor correction and continue on to something wonderful. But if you're not showing other people your work as you go along, if you're not having team reviews or peer reviews or any type of collaboration, then all of a sudden, a week or two later, you've put all of this effort into this design, and by this point, the flaw is so big, you're not going to be able to save the project at all. So first, activities. I get a good portion of my activities from the book Brainstorming by Dave Gray, Sonny Brown, and James Macanufo, and more often these days from the website. It actually started as just a list of brainstorming activities because they realized that most adults weren't getting much out of brainstorming. They found that when they were consulting with teams, either one person would be louder than the rest of the room, or the team would get stuck on just one idea, or there would be no specific goal in mind. And so they just started a list of every activity that they could think of. And that turned into a book, and now that's turned into a website of activities. I also get a lot of activities just from watching children's television. I love the Muppets. I have no excuse for it. I have 2 nieces that I use as an excuse. 3 now. I have 3 nieces. Don't tell one that I forgot about her. I use them as an excuse. We watch a lot of Sesame Street, a lot of Daniel Tiger, and shockingly, the silly little games and activities that kids TV shows use to get kids working together or playing together or learning something new, they work just as well for us adults. It's crazy. So if you have children in your life, go looking for them for activities to use. If you don't, check out the Gamestorming website. Essentially what we're trying to do is get everybody together to discuss this work that impacts all of us. This is one of the best ways to get past the confusion of whose job is it to do what, because instead you start to look at, okay, we're going to all solidify this idea together, and then we can talk about A, B, or C. Do we want you to do this, me to do that other thing, and you to do this third thing? Do we want to meet back up and review it together tomorrow? You can sort of identify what the plan is going to be together. And these activities make it easier for everybody to participate in that discussion. Secondly, exercises. The difference between an activity and an exercise, to my mind, is that an activity is something that you do to get conversation going. An exercise is a step in the process. Some of the exercises that I recommend are peer reviews and pair programming. When developers do pair programming, they work side by side with one person checking over the other's work, and then after a while the two will swap. When the rest of us are pair programming, it's a way for us to say, we don't know exactly how we're going to do this. We don't know, for example, if we want content to come first or design to come first on this screen. So we're each going to sketch out how we think it would work. The content strategist will approach it from a messaging side. The designer will approach it from sketching out a UI. And then they'll swap, and they'll be able to see where the other person's head was at and how they can either merge them or things that they might have missed out on before. It's just a great exercise to do. Another one is any kind of peer reviews. The more often, the better. Even if it's just 5 minutes every morning, somebody glancing over and a chance for people to ask questions. Particularly if you've kicked off with some activities at the start of your work together, you'll hopefully be a little more comfortable talking to each other and opening up about both constructive criticism and just questions. And that really opens the door to not just the knowledge of what each other are doing, but also really being able to work together. The third step to this 4-step process is including our soft skills. The soft skills, these are the things that we don't talk about so much. The big ones for me are empathy and compassion. They're not as easy to set down in stone and just learn as hard skills are because, for example, it doesn't matter who you are. The button that deletes the last layer will always be the same. That's a hard skill. It's easy to learn. Soft skills, well, empathy is going to feel a little different for everybody, so it's harder to teach. But for me, empathy comes down to saying, I don't know everything, and compassion comes down to saying, you don't know everything. And once I recognize I don't know everything and so I need you, and you don't know everything so I can help you, then we're less likely to start asking accusatory things like, what were you doing, or why did you do that? And more likely to ask more open-ended questions like, can you lead me through your thought process, or how can I help, or what do you think of this? And number 4, the tools. This is what everybody always wants to leave with. Everybody always wants to say, okay, we've had some theory, we've had some ideas, we've talked about history. Now tell me what I can walk away from, what I can walk away with and go back to my boss and say, hey, I went to this webinar and here's the new tool. It's going to fix everything for us. Well, I'm sorry to say it, but I don't have any magic tools. But what I do have are a couple of tools that I found will help. All of these, the editorial calendars, checklists, user journeys, and what I'm calling shared spaces, but you can actually just call a whiteboard, all of these are getting at the same thing. Something that is in a shared space that allows everybody to look back at one thing and connect to it. It doesn't matter if this is in a cloud or in a room, on the wall, it doesn't matter where it is. But all 4 of these, for example, an editorial calendar is where we might say, these are the events that are going on over the next month. These are the blog articles that we want to publish that connect to those events. These are the major holidays going on. This is what's going on in the lives of our users. And it marks everything down as closely as they can to specific dates so that you can plan ahead for it. And I actually find that this is a good way to get some of the marketing people together with some of the design people and get a little bit less of the, hey, I need you and your help right now, this minute, put down everything you're doing, even though I forgot to plan ahead for it. It also causes a little bit less of the challenge that particularly startups seem to have between spending time on building the final product and getting some buzz going. If the design team, the product team, can look at the calendar that the marketing team has going on, and the marketing team can see on that same calendar what deadlines are coming up for the product team, then they can work together and identify how they can help each other out and how they can aim to have some of their goals either happen at the same time or really support one another. Similarly, user journeys, something really valuable for everybody to look at and be able to see how does the IA support that journey? How does the content that we're creating support that journey? How does the layout, the UI that we're putting together support that journey? And shared spaces, this is really what it's all about, is either having a space in the cloud where everybody can see everyone else's inspirations, having a whiteboard where you can write down notes for that editorial calendar. This is what it's all about. So thank you all so much for coming today. And I think, Adam, we have a couple minutes now if we want to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Marli. Definitely a very informative webinar. The first question that has come in is, how can I learn to become a better content strategist? Any books to recommend, online courses, further education suggestions?
Oh, goodness, so many. I would say a good place to start, there are a couple of giant lists of content strategy resources. One is from Jonathan Coleman. Another is actually on my site, Content Strategy Resources list. If you're starting absolutely from scratch, there is a great Content Strategy 101 book and Christina Halverson's book on content for the web. It's also a great place to start. If you're looking to get a little more in-depth with a little more detail, then I think those resources lists are going to have a lot of articles that are really valuable and books on sort of specific areas within content strategy.
Great, thank you very much. The next question that came in is, do you have any recommendations for smaller teams that don't have a separate person for each role?
Yeah, that's a really tough place that people are in, and that's particularly where activities can be helpful, because that's where it gets tricky. You know, it's like I said, when you're a UX team of one, you're just doing everything. When you're thrown into a giant team, a lot of times they're so separated out that you just have to figure out how to get communication going on. But when you've got a team of like 4 people or 3 people, and so maybe you've got a content strategist and you've got a UX designer, but you don't know what part of UX design that UX designer does. Are they more of a visual designer, more of an IA? You sort of don't know how those roles are going to overlap. So that's an area where doing an activity so that you can focus on what the goals are and what the process you're going to use is going to be, rather than focusing on those titles, is going to be really helpful.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome.
The next question that's come in, Marli, is are any of the current user experience jobs just going to disappear altogether?
Probably. I don't think we're done evolving. I think there is a lot of room to grow. I think it's unlikely that, for example, content strategy is suddenly going to start meaning visual design. But as we are creating more tools to help us do our work, there is, for example, obviously content strategy is an area that I'm kind of focused in. So to use an example from there are content strategists who focus predominantly on CMS and technology, and as a result are learning quite a bit of front-end development. And I can't imagine that either role of those 2 roles will completely disappear, but the term content technologist is popping up here and there. So I don't know if that is going to start creeping up and maybe overtake content strategy at some point.
Okay, thank you. The next question that's come in is, any thoughts on getting project leaders with poor soft skills to adapt, embrace, and support them?
You know, I have 2 thoughts on that. The first is that to some extent the soft skills are something that we can only enforce upon ourselves. You can hope and try to demonstrate by a good example how valuable those soft skills are, and ultimately the end results of using a lot of those soft skills will be that you'll be more productive personally and your work will improve as a result. But then the second thought I have on it is that I think there are better ways than the ways that we've been using thus far. I've seen people have mandatory sessions on using soft skills, and to me that seems a little bit extreme. That seems like we're going into the realm of almost like anger management courses or something. And while I think those certainly have a place, I'm not sure that place is to try and force people to better understand soft skills which can't be forced, simply because I don't think they can be forced. So there's got to be a better way to teach them, but the best I know of thus far is just to set a good example.
Thank you.
And I guess, and enjoy and value the benefits to your own career.
Great, thank you, Marli. The next question that's come in is, how about resources for knowledge management strategy?
So can we get a little bit more detail there? Resources for knowledge management strategy? Are you asking what roles or what tools? I'm not sure I understand.
I am waiting to hear back to see if the
Okay.
person, but while we'll wait for that answer, the next question, here we go. Books or online resources, resources to learn about it.
A lot of knowledge management strategies are focused on intranets, and so to some extent it's going to depend what sort of technology the team's using. I'm not familiar with any particular case studies offhand, but I think searching for internet case studies and internal strategies. I've noticed brings up a lot more than knowledge management as a search term, so there may be some useful information there. If you're looking to develop your own strategy, I would also say just getting a good sense for how you would develop an external content strategy can give a lot of insight, which you can then adapt into an internal strategy. They're really not all that different. In fact, I think creating an internal strategy can be more difficult because we assume people know so much more than they actually do. And so if we treat our internal people as though they were external clients, we are a lot more likely to create information and knowledge that's going to be valuable to them and useful and usable.
Great. Thank you, Marli. The next question that's come in is, if user experience design is the process and not a specific role, why do so many companies still hire for UX designers?
I don't know. I think to some part that speaks to exactly what this confusion with terminology is creating. At some point, I suspect that either the term UX design for the process will shift into a new term. We'll start using a different term to describe that process, or UX designer will stop being what we refer to that role as. In the meantime, I think there are a lot of companies out there who still think they can find unicorns. And there's certainly, like I said, there's nothing wrong with being a jack of all trades. And so we will at some point need a term, maybe unicorn is the right term, for somebody who knows a little bit about a lot of different areas and can do a little bit around all of those. I would think that would be a UX manager or a UX professional. But I think that's part of the education that we're all responsible for, is helping our companies to recognize that they can't expect one person to be specialized in design and content and development.
Great. Thank you, Marli. And the last question that has come in is, do you have any suggestions for how to share this kind of information with my company or teach my company about the UX process?
Feel free to steal these slides. They'll be up on the DCL website. I think also the video will be up. I would also say look for specific situations and examples that are relevant to your company. So create your own deck. You can take some of these ideas. You can pull from Jared Spool has done a couple of talks on UX basics. I think Marco Bloomstein has done one or two, and there are just so many great people out there who have done so many overviews of UX, but it's not really going to hit home with your company unless you identify some specific situations where they could use it and what the problems that they're facing that can be solved through improving their UX process will be. And so whoever slides you start with, whether it's mine or someone else's, take those and then add in your own to personalize it and show them what the return on investment will be, because that's such a key component. You know, if you're working, we speak so much in UX about identifying what our user's goal is. When you're talking to the higher ups at your company, you have to identify what their goal is. They have their own problems that they want to solve, and then you need to identify for them how UX can be that solution.
Great. Well, thank you, Marli, and thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This concludes today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the webinar archive section of our website located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be next Wednesday, March 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Converting Your Legacy Data to S1000D, presented by Nave Greenberg, Director of U.S. Defense Development, DCL. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.